for someone who's kind of new to practicing outside of their own home. In other words, when they first start trying to practice within a community of practitioners, what should they be examining?
In terms of looking at the community?
Yeah. It's also, it's one thing to say, like, there's the exalted Vajrayana teacher, but then frequently, just given the Dharma's been 30 years now, you have various kinds of either implicit or explicit mentor relationships that occur within the community of practitioners.
And
then also just, and even authorities of things aside, there's just, you get a group of people together, and sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it doesn't work so well.
Yeah, most often. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one too, because I don't want to say that, the Sangha, so-called, or the community of students of a particular teacher necessarily reflects on the teacher, because that would make me feel terrible, for instance, like, oh my gosh, am I representing Kala Rinpoche? I'm so sorry. So I think, I don't think that's necessarily true. There's been great teachers with all kinds of crazy students who misinterpret them and so on. But there is a certain, like, you might want to, aside from the question of the teacher altogether, I think there are certain kind of like red flags, as you said, about groups. One of them is how closed or open the system is. If it's a completely closed system, if there's no inquiry outside the system, here's the answer to this, and you ask the question, but it's still within the system, and this answer, kind of quoting scripture or quoting the guru's perfect words, or and there's never any outer going outside of that. I think that's problematic, because then it becomes a kind of groupthink, and the language you can recognize, everyone's talking this certain language and they're all thinking this certain way, and that never changes, because once you have a particular pattern of thought, you don't ever get outside that box, so then you're trapped. And I think that's, and also, of course, that goes to behavior too. Everyone's behaving a certain way, so everyone else behaves a certain way, and nobody ever questions that. And so then there's no comparison with a broader community. One thing where teachers and gurus have an influence there is on keeping their students away from other teachers. And I think that's a red flag for sure. If somebody says, don't go see other teachers, don't go attend this talk, I think that's, and that kind of sectarianism also occurred in Tibet, and I think that's very problematic. There it has more to do with lineage and lineage blessing and seeing if the lineage was tainted or not. But that, we don't want to do that. And if you can't trust a student to make up their own, discriminating wisdom about getting something positive out of another teacher without getting stupid about it, then you're not training that person correctly. There can be too much of a babying, like...
You're not cultivating their independence.
Yeah, you should be cultivating their... I mean, to me, it seems a teacher, you want to train a person with, their path in mind without you in it, and without this life, the next life and the next life. I mean, it's a really long, broad viewpoint and perspective, and to keep people like sheltered within a little thing, I personally, this is maybe my personal, gripe, but I find it very kind of suspicious when that goes on. I mean, there's certain circumstances like long retreats where obviously you're not intermingling with all kinds of other people, and that's what those are for. And then in that case, I think it's appropriate. So that's one thing. And then personally, my personal idea of group and a community is that it should not be highly judgmental, and it should not be necessarily uniform and hierarchical or competitive. Like, I'm doing this practice and that's better than you doing that practice. And that's, of course, it's human nature. And as soon as you try and present a path, like A, B, C, then you have people saying, I'm at C and I'm not B. But I mean, that we've had so much advice from the great masters about this, of, like masters who spent their whole life doing the preliminary practices, did 9 gazillion. One of my teachers, Dejang Rinpoche, did like 8 million something or others, and his teacher did that. And, so we know that even though there's a progression of a path, it's not a hierarchy of this is better than that. I'm totally convinced that if someone practiced refuge, going for refuge to the kind of most profound level, that would be a total path in itself. So I think that becomes problematic, and in a group, it's exacerbated. You're just practicing at home and you're not thinking so much, I'm better than this other person, but that does happen in a group. Now, the Tibetans work with that, and they like having competitiveness because they think it, aids in diligence, and maybe so, but I'm not sure about the ultimate outcome of that kind of diligence. Now, feeling supported on the path, getting through 100,000 prostrations, let's say, and it's really hard, and that somebody else is having a hard time, and maybe they're going to tell you, and you're going to compare. I think that's very healthy and fine. It's just the sort of spiritual elitism that's just so obnoxious. It's really kind of unbearable. It keeps me out of communities. I'm a bad person to ask about communities because I have
definitely the Groucho Marx school. I would belong to a club that would have me.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel that way too, and sometimes I think I go for refuge in the Buddha, I go for refuge in the Dharma, and I go for refuge from the Sangha.
Yeah, Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah, I just it's problematic, but I think there are definitely places where it develops along a really healthy thing, and a whole community can mature together, and that's also possible, and also be very supportive. So it's the groupthink aspect that bothers me personally, that I think you have to watch for. When people become unable to communicate to regular people because they're so ensconced in the one system of their own particular community, I think that's problematic.
Okay. That's very helpful. Something that's kind of related in terms of, well, use the phrase spiritual elitism.
Mm-hmm.
The famous term that Trungpa Rinpoche coined for something else was spiritual materialism.
Right.
And I was curious about how you've seen the expressions of that change over time, and just how you currently see it manifest.
I see. In the West, particularly?
Yeah.
Because, Tibetan Buddhism so lends itself to the most sort of superficial level of spiritual materialism, is simply that we all collect a bunch of, Dharma paraphernalia, which is one of the less harmful forms, I think, but still happens. And Tibetan Buddhism provides that kind of materialism to all the other Buddhist groups, too. You don't find all that junk outside the conference in the little booths. Outside of Buddhist conferences, it's all Tibetan stuff. So, except for little sand.
The rake thing.
The little rake thing for Zen, that's it, But, how it's progressed. In a way it's become more sophisticated, I suppose, whereas spiritual materialism, that's such a hard concept. One time, there's been different explanations of what Trungpa Rinpoche meant by it, and I had a friend, Ken MacLeod, who asked him once, what's the translation, in Tibetan? And what he told him, which is not what you find in other books, he said it means Jirmin Chupa, which means to practice non-Dharma. In other words, to practice the Dharma, to co-opt the Dharma so that it's actually having the opposite effect of what you want it to have. And I would say that happens in like every minute of our life. It just constantly happens. That's just the tendency of it, and that's why Vajrayana particularly has to be so tricky with it, because we're constantly co-opting it to add to our ego base, our like I'm so great, everything. There's a huge amount of warnings on just like having a good meditation experience and what a bad effect that can have. You actually have a moment of emptiness where you recognize emptiness, and it's almost instantly bad because you're immediately clinging to it. And that's spiritual materialism right there. It's like, I have this, and it's so there's it just gets more and more subtle. And I think as a community, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly in the beginning there was like how many, what you mentioned, my guru, the fact that you could say my guru, that's a kind of spiritual materialism, and I've had this many empowerments and this many teachings, and he's told me blah blah, and I'm this, and I have names, I can be called Acharya, and I can be called Lama, and I can be called this and that, and it's just all those things. But I think personally, people who get real caught in that, I just dismiss and don't even count as part of the spiritual. I mean, it's a complete diversion, and they go off then you see them in conferences proclaiming something, and really they're not going any deeper at all. They're just endlessly caught up in what they are and what they have. But on the more subtle level, I think people have to work with it and even counteract it in particular, like the famous story of the Tibetan guy yogi in a cave with his bowls of water on the shrine, and he heard that his sponsor was coming, the one person who keeps him in retreat, and he shined all his bowls, and then he realized what he was doing. He kind of caught himself, and then he threw dirt in them for when the sponsor came. I mean, you have to almost particularly watch yourself not to accept people's projections of how great you are, because then that just becomes an accumulation of stuff, that, more obscuration of about how really great you are. How great you are becomes the obstacle to how great you are.